Professor Alan Lunz, a very well-known world-class scientist from Stanford University of United States. Professor Alan Lunz has kindly accepted our invitation for this seminar, which is a part of our Chemical Sciences seminar series. He will give a great talk about future batteries for electric vehicles, opportunities and challenges. We will have a session for questions at the end of the talk. The question can be asked by sending a message through the chat button of the Zoom platform, as well as by raising hand. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Alan Lunz. He obtained his PhD in physical chemistry in 1968 from the University of California, Berkeley, and spent the next 25 years as a research staff member at the IBM Almaden Research Laboratory. Following this, he became professor of physics at the University of Southern Denmark, and then returned to California as visiting scientist and later adjunct professor at SLAC, National Accelerator Laboratory. He has participated in many international collaborations, both in Denmark and elsewhere around the world, through extended periods as either visiting or adjunct professor, University of Geneva, University of Southern Denmark, Danish Technical University, Aarhus University, and the University of California, Berkeley. He also spent a year at the Fritz Haber Institute in Berlin on a Humboldt Senior Research Award. During his almost 50-year research career, he has been involved in many research fields, laser spectroscopy, reactive gas phase dynamics, surface science and gas surface dynamics, astrochemistry, and most recently, batteries. In 2009, he rejoined IBM Almaden as a consultant to help start a program in lithium air batteries, and shortly thereafter joined to SANCAT, Center for Interface Science and Catalysis Group at SLAC, Stanford University. At this point, I want to hand over the word to Professor Alan Lunz. Alan, you're welcome once again, and please begin your talk.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Let's see. I don't know that my... Thank you very much. What I'd like, I'm having a little trouble here getting started. Anyway, what I'd like to do is to tell you, thanks very much for the introduction, kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do is to tell you a little bit of what I know about batteries for electric vehicles, and some of the research that's going on in the cell chemistry, in the battery cell chemistry, to make those even better. So, as most of you know, battery electric vehicles have been growing more or less exponentially for the past 10 years. So there are now about 5 million electric vehicles in the world. And this is they're largely in China, the EU, and the US. And they're projected to grow to something like 50 to 100 million by 2030. However, to get this growth, there have been it's been based both on financial incentives and regulations trying to minimize carbon emissions. And because you need these kinds of incentives, that tells you right away that there are some problems in competing with normal internal combustion engine cars. The cost, range, charge rate, safety, and also in charging infrastructure. And all of those in red are really just battery issues. So I will spend most of the time trying to tell you a little bit about some of the research that's going on in the battery chemistry to circumvent some of these or make these less important. In charging infrastructure, let me just start with that briefly. I guess, at least from the web, I just took this off the web. In Turkey, there are not too many charging stations right now, although they will probably grow. But that's because there are not a lot of EVs. On the other hand, where I live in California, there are a huge number of electric vehicles. And in California, about half of all the EVs in the US are in California. And there's a lot of charging stations. You're just saturated with charging stations. And the reason for that is, this is Tesla country. Tesla is somewhere about right there. So they're providing a lot of cars for this local area. And there's a lot of charging stations. And the point is that once you have a lot of EVs, the charging stations follow very quickly because they are a good business opportunity. Even the oil companies are getting into it. So my suspicion is that as things grow here, you will look like this soon. Okay, so now I'd like to go to the some of the battery chemistry issues. Let's first take a look at what what is in a state-of-the-art EV right now, and that's a Tesla Model 3 typically. So the cost of the battery is something like a third of the cost of the car. So it's an extensive part. The range is something like 500 kilometers. And that's really based on what determines that is principally is the energy density of the cell. And this can be given either in a gravimetric sense, watt hours per kilogram, or in a volumetric sense, watt hours per liter. They're of course related, but the most important one for EVs, at least cars, is probably the volumetric one. And so we'll talk a lot more about that. So the cycle life is something like 400,000 kilometers, or about 15 years of normal driving. And that's principally determined by the Coulombic efficiency of the battery. When you discharge and charge a battery once, you lose a little bit of the active lithium. And the fraction that you retain is given as the Coulombic efficiency. So if you want to charge and discharge, say 1,000 times, and still maintain about 80% of your battery capacity, which will give you this kind of a lifetime, then you need a number something like this in the Coulombic efficiency. So this is a very important number for the lifetime of the battery. The charge rates currently are fairly long. It depends a lot on the charging infrastructure, how much power you have, but they're typically half an hour, give or take a little bit. But most people with EVs charge overnight at home or at work at much lower powers. And this seems to be, at least for the time being, the most practical way to charge. In terms of safety, there are problems. The batteries can catch fire, spectacular fires. But the number of accidents or fires is quite low compared to even petrol-based cars. Okay, so, excuse me. Let me say a few words just about what is in a conventional lithium-ion battery before we start talking about the changes. They can really consist of a graphite anode, a layered transition metal oxide cathode, and an ion-conducting electrolyte, which is based of some lithium salt in organic carbonates. So discharge of the battery means taking a lithium, both of these can intercalate lithium. So discharge is taking a lithium ion from the cathode into the anode. And causing redox in this material. So electrons flow through to maintain charge neutrality. That whole process is thermodynamically downhill, so it generates a potential. And to charge the battery, you apply a potential and drive the lithium ions back the other way. So that's the basics of the lithium-ion battery. But there's another very important part to that battery, which is the solid electrolyte interface. Because the anode is at such a low potential, just slightly above lithium metal, it reduces the electrolyte. It continually reduces the electrolyte as long as it can. And of course, so the interface is just a mixture of these reduced compounds, a whole series of inorganic and organic materials that played out on the cathode particles. And ultimately, if they have a low enough electronic conductivity, this reduction in consumption of the electrolyte stops. So it's a very important part of defining what the Coulombic efficiency is. And it's some tens of nanometers thick typically. So this is a very important part, and we'll get back to that in a minute. Okay, as you all know, the pioneers of the lithium-ion, practical lithium-ion batteries were given the 2019 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Okay, so let's go back to these limitations of the current lithium-ion. Let's first talk about cost. Cost has been going down almost dramatically since 2010 when they first started. That was principally economies of scale, but now, since there are many gigafactories around building up or existing, it's more about optimizing the manufacturing. And so that's a slower process. Nevertheless, right now it's at about $150 per kilowatt hour, and it's projected to go down to $100 per kilowatt hour in, I don't know, somewhere in the 1 to 5 year time frame. And that's important because at that point, EVs will be cheaper than conventional internal combustion engine cars. So then we may see a dramatic uptake in their use. Okay, so that I think will take care of itself. The question of range, which as I said is principally dependent on energy density in the cell, they've also been increasing with the years. This is the volumetric one, and this is the gravimetric one. They increase, but only at something like 5 to 7% a year. And soon they will be hitting physical chemical limits. So they really won't be able, as long as you keep the chemistry the same, they won't get much beyond where they are now. So that's a large part of the motivation for trying to evolve the chemistry in the cells. In terms of safety, there is, as long as you have a liquid electrolyte, which is a flammable liquid electrolyte, you'll have a safety issue. Although, as I mentioned, I think it's not as severe as many people worry about. And charge rate's a more serious issue. And that's more fundamental to the problem of a battery. It turns out there's a fundamental plot that all batteries, in fact, all energy storage has, and that's called the Rigoni plot. And what you do is if you look at the power density versus the energy density, they always have these curved shapes. And the lithium ion is something like this. So in fact, you can make a lithium ion battery, which is very high power density, very high charge rate. However, you don't have much energy density. And so most people, because they want range, concentrate in this range where the energy density, the power density is much more modest. Charge rates are more modest. And that's a fundamental trade-off that you have to make with this chemistry. And it also turns out that there's some significant trade-offs in lifetime and safety with charge rate as well. So at least with this chemistry, as it now stands, we probably won't see dramatic changes in the charge rate, at least from the chemistry point of view. There are other ways you can optimize the charge rate. So I just want to give a kind of general overview of what some of the important research themes are right now in the cell chemistry. Talk about a couple of them in more detail here. They're in red. So in the anode side, there's a lot of work going on in silicon and silicon monoxide, SiO, adding that to the graphite or using them by themselves. And the reason is their capacity of uptake of lithium is about an order of magnitude higher than graphite. So you can make a much higher capacity anode with these materials. The problem is when they take up this lithium, they expand dramatically, about 300 to 400%. And that either pulverizes the small particles that compose them, or at least keeps breaking apart the SEI, and you have to reform it all the time. Every time you reform it, you consume lithium, active lithium in the electrolyte. And so pretty soon you end up with a very low coulombic efficiency with these materials. So there's a lot of work trying to solve this problem of the volume expansion of the silicon, or SiOX. And there are some companies out there that have been successful at it, small startup companies. The problem is that they can't produce batteries using these things in a scalable and cost-effective way yet. So this is not it. So although this is a good research battery, it doesn't make yet a good practical battery for an EV. I'm going to talk much more about lithium metal, but a lot of the same considerations can be said about that. There are some very good research batteries now being made with lithium metal, and I'll show you some of those. On the cathode end of things, typical cathodes are lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt oxide, for example. That's one of the best cathode materials. And there's a tremendous push throughout the industry to get rid of cobalt as much as you can, because that's the most expensive item in the cathode and in the battery in general. Also, there are a lot of ethical problems about how it's mined. So most batteries right now have either 30% or 20% cobalt in them. There's a lot of interest in trying to push in the short term to 10% cobalt, 10% manganese. And this continues. They want to even go lower than that. You can actually go lower than that. They're trying and actually make things that, for example, use other redox besides just the transition metals to get the lithium in, things like using the oxygen. And also they want to push these things to higher voltage. The problem with all of these attempts to do this is that the cathode particles become much less stable. And particularly they tend to have either phase transitions or they react with the electrolytes. But at any rate, you have problems at the surfaces of these particles, which allow dissolution of some of the transition metals. And this causes all kinds of problems on the anode side. And so it's a real problem about causes voltage fade and a low coulombic efficiency. So there's a lot of work going on in trying to put specific coatings on it, on these materials that will inhibit the problems at the surfaces of the particles. Okay, on the electrolyte, for years, people have played a game of trying to optimize the SEI by putting in a little additive of this or a little additive of that. In fact, people tell me they're up to 50 additives in some of the commercial batteries now, just trying to stabilize this SEI so you have a long, a very stable SEI and a high coulombic efficiency, long cycle life. However, whenever you change the anode, you have to go through that all again. So there's a lot of work now going on to try to optimize the electrolytes for silicon anodes, for lithium metal anodes, and so forth. And of course, trying to get a higher oxidative stability so you can use higher voltages in the cathodes. The other thing that's going on is and there's a lot of activity right now, research activity, and a lot of startup companies as well, trying to combine lithium metal with solid state. And so I'll talk a little bit about electrolytes now and lithium metal with solid state. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of advantages to going to lithium metal instead of using graphite with lithium intercalated graphite. The main one is it's got an order of magnitude more capacity. So if you look at the volumetric energy density you expect for a conventional lithium-ion, state-of-the-art lithium-ion, it looks something like this here. As I will explain to you in a minute, when you use lithium metal, you have a real problem about consuming active lithium in the cycle. In a discharge charge cycle, you consume some of the active lithium, you have a very low coulombic efficiency. So one way around that is just to add a lot of extra lithium. The problem, which can then be used, the problem with that is then you don't get the advantages of using this high capacity battery to lower to give you a higher volumetric energy density. So you can have just a little bit of extra lithium than you're using in the discharge charge, but then that's very hard to deal with. So what most people have tried to do is to develop what's called an anode-free. You just have a little bit bigger cathode, and so you store a little bit more lithium in the cathode when you start, and then you first charge the battery and plate out the lithium. And then you can go back and forth between discharge and charge using up all of the lithium. And then you get a huge increase in volumetric energy density. So this is the game people are mostly playing. Now the question is, do you want to do this with a liquid or solid? And people, different groups or different companies actually are pushing different approaches. For example, Tesla is mostly looking at the liquid approach. Volkswagen and Toyota are in partnerships with companies doing solid electrolytes. So I'll talk a little bit about both of them as best I can. So what is the problem to generate, and first off, what's the problem with lithium metal? Well, the problem really is that lithium or lithium vacancies diffuse slowly compared to the electrochemical rates you're trying to do. So if you discharge a battery at any reasonable rate, you end up with a rough surface. It doesn't smooth out. And if you charge, even if you started with a smooth surface, you end up with a rough surface again. So if you do this cycle back and forth many times, what you end up with is what's called mossy lithium. It's very rough, has a lot of surface area, so it consumes a lot of the lithium in the electrolyte, making the SEI. The other thing is a lot of the lithium metal that you've produced now is coated with the SEI, so it's not in electrical contact with the current collector or the current collector. So it's called dead lithium. So it's isolated, it's passivated. So all of these things lead to consumption of the active lithium at a low coulombic efficiency. So that's the main problem. And of course, that means a low cycle life. Now, what turns out to be true is that you can, that tailoring the SEI by changing the electrolyte has a big effect on all these things. And we'll see an example of that in a minute. The other problem that happens is that you can get dendrites. And when dendrites grow, they actually can cause a short and a fire. So that just means you're growing at the tip of this particle. And so it's important to know when the dendrites form. And there's been some very nice work. It turns out that if you look at how much capacity you have in the battery or how much lithium you're trying to plate out versus current density, there seems to be a very sharp dividing line between the two. So that if you stay in this regime, you can have a more or less stable battery with perhaps a lower coulombic efficiency. But if you're in this regime, you have a very unsafe battery. So there's sort of a critical current density for forming these dendrites. And it turns out that where this actually forms when the concentration of lithium at the surface gets small enough that the rate of the reaction is dominated by lithium diffusion to the surface. So you only get diffusion limited aggregation instead of a reaction that's dominated by the electrochemical reaction of the electrode. And it turns out this depends heavily on the concentration of the electrolyte and on what's called the anion transference ratio, which when you apply a field, you pull the anions away from the anode, and that they pull the lithium ions with them. So that can deplete the concentration as well. So what is probably the best example of an anode-free battery in a liquid that I've seen was by a Tesla group. It just came out a few weeks ago. And so I just share with you what it shows now. So what they have is the black line is a conventional graphite anode lithium-ion battery, optimum state-of-the-art, and it will cycle for thousands of times. So it doesn't show any change in the, this is the energy density versus cycle number, shows no change in that period, the number of cycles. But when they made their optimum lithium metal battery in an electrolyte, they got quite a substantial increase in the energy density here. And it lasted, 200 cycles or so. And that seems to be the state of the art. But to achieve that, they had to really kind of tailor make the SEI. They used very concentrated solutions, so they didn't have dendrites. Salt solutions, they used dual fluorinated salts, they used dual kinds of solvents, and that was how they got the SEI. There's still a lot of games to play in trying to tailor this SEI, I think, so they will continue to optimize it. The other thing they did is they added a high pressure, which of course compresses the lithium and tends to smooth it, and that helps to give a longer cycle life because it doesn't get as rough. You can do that in the laboratory very easily. It's not at all clear whether you can do that in a car battery. So I don't know whether that'll translate. That part of it will translate into a car battery. Okay, now I'd like to go to the all solid. That's all I'm going to say about liquid electrolytes. And I think that is the state of the art right now. There's a huge amount of work going on in solid state lithium metal batteries. And there's a lot of advantages to it if you can get it to work reliably and well. And so I just try to list some of them here. The main advantage, or one of the, this is a picture of a conventional lithium-ion battery. This is the graphite anode. This is the liquid electrolyte and the separator to hold it in place, and then the cathode. So what you do in the solid state battery is you replace this with a solid state electrolyte, you replace this with lithium, and the rest stays more or less the same. But you can see that immediately, you can just see qualitatively that gets you a much higher energy density in watt hours per liter. In addition, now because this is a solid, you can stack one on top of the other and get bipolar stacking. You can stack many together, and that also will help you get some energy density. You can't do that with the liquids very easily because they'll run out. So the other thing is, because these guys are stiff, they should block dendrites, but we'll come back to that issue, which are always possible in this guy. They're non-flammable, so you have a safety issue. It turns out they're single ion conductors. The anions don't conduct anything. They don't move. So this doesn't give you any concentration issues, so you can get higher power density. In principle, you have a static interface between the metal and the electrolyte. So this means you don't keep reforming this SEI all the time. Part of it reforms in a liquid. You don't reform and it's static. So in principle, that should give you a higher Coulombic efficiency. And it turns out you actually can get a higher temperature range in principle. But of course, nothing is for free. There are all kinds of challenges with solid state batteries. which many people are working on now. So one of the issues is how do you keep two interfaces in intimate contact as the lithium is undergoing a volume and morphology change. And coupled with that is how do you maintain homogeneous current distributions at the same time so you don't get electrical hotspots. So this is a major issue. When they're not in good contact or don't have a homogeneous current distribution, you'll always get very high interfacial impedances, high resistances at these interfaces. And then you won't be able to get any current through the battery. So that's one major issue. The other issue is there's always a question whether the solid state electrolytes are stable against the electrodes. And so that's something that it turns out is not so simple to solve either. And then it turns out that although you weren't supposed to get dendrites, you do get dendrites in these things. And so there's some different mechanisms for growing dendrites, which have to be understood. The way you make these solid state electrolytes is you center together a bunch of small particles. So there can be voids, there can be grain boundaries. All of these things can affect the conductivity, the lithium-ion conductivity through these electrolytes. And then there's also the issue when you want to go to a practical battery from a lab. Can you do scalable processing? Can you do that cost effectively and so forth? So from a practical point of view, there are still unresolved issues about this. Okay, so one of the things I didn't say is a challenge is lithium-ion conductivity, because it turns out that when you look at the conductivity, this is a log of the conductivity versus 1/T or T up here. These are conventional liquid electrolytes in batteries today, these curved lines. There are several electrolytes that have lithium-ion conductivities comparable to those of the liquid electrolyte, particularly these sulfides. Some of the oxides, particularly this one, and some of these others have conductivities that are roughly an order of magnitude lower, but they're still in a regime which is good enough to build a battery. So most of the concentration and a lot of this work is being done in startup companies. So we don't know exactly what they're doing, but I think most of them are using, or many are using the sulfides because you need this kind of a conductivity roughly to get a very high capacity battery with thick electrodes. On the other hand, some companies and much research is going on in, say, this material, where you can make a stack of thin film batteries, which would also give you high capacity. At any rate, it looks like there are materials with enough lithium-ion superionic conductivity to build batteries with. So what about this poor interfacial contact? What can you do about that? I mean, there are all kinds of reasons you can get poor interfacial contact and these impedances. Roughening of the thing, contamination, grain boundaries at the surface, which are not as conductive, all kinds of defects. So how do you kind of smooth this in cycling, as it tends to get worse when you cycle? Well, one of them is to have a malleable solid state electrolyte. The lithium's fairly malleable, but you need if you have a malleable solid state electrolyte, that helps, and sulfides certainly are. The oxides are not so much. If you apply high pressure, you can squeeze the things together and make good contact. But again, that's an issue, maybe an issue in practical batteries, but not in the lab. And then it turns out there's a way to put, if you put materials, a thin layer of materials that alloy with lithium, like germanium or gold or something like that, on the surface of the lithium, it acts as a wetting agent. And as you grow the lithium, it tends to float on the surface and act as something of a wetting agent. Exactly how that works is not known, or at least by me. I think it has a lot to do with lowering the nucleation over potential for forming lithium on these surfaces. And so that it grows lots of little, it grows at lots of places at once instead of just growing on one crystal at the defect, one crystal of lithium at the defect. Okay, the stability, you asked the question, are these electrolytes stable at the electrodes? And that's a tough question to answer experimentally because they're buried interfaces, but people have done a lot of work experimentally. But from DFT, it's very clear that if you look at a variety of electrolytes versus lithium chemical potential, which is equivalent to the potential in the battery, you can understand their stability or thermodynamic stability at any rate with DFT. And only in these green regions are these electrolytes stable before they decompose thermodynamically, would decompose into other materials, mixture of other compounds. They may have some kinetic stability, which is the dotted lines here. But as you can see, many of them are not stable at the anode, where the lithium metal is, only this one, which is why it's very much in vogue now as a material. The others are not. They're unstable at both the anode and cathode. A few are stable at the cathode, but not many. These are not high conductivity materials. So you need, basically you need either good natural SEI to isolate them or artificial SEI, and good, which means a coating usually on the electrode particles. Good means it has to have a pretty good lithium-ion conductivity, but a poor electrical conductivity, so that the growth of the SEI terminates because you can no longer redox through it anymore and consume the, or react with the, have redox reactions with the electrolyte. So what has been quite successful with the sulfide electrolytes right now is, and actually with the oxides too, I think, is you put thin lithium oxide coatings on the cathode particles, nanometer size thick things. And what that does, they're stable against both the cathode. These are materials like lithium niobate or lithium tantalate or lithium zirconium oxide. They're thermodynamically stable against both the cathode and the electrolyte. And so what happens is you drop most of the chemical potential across these nanometers of stable materials, and then you're at a low chemical potential in the solid state electrolyte so that it's thermodynamically stable. Unfortunately, you can't really quite play the same game with cathode as well, because there aren't many materials that are stable against lithium metal. It's just so reducing. So in that case, you're pretty much limited to what you can do with natural SEI. You can tailor the electrolyte to have a good SEI, and that's somewhat done by attaching chlorine to making chlorinating the sulfides, for example. They form better SEI. Also the, what I call these wetting agents seem to help a little bit. At any rate, so that's all I'm going to say. We'll come back and I'll show you an example in a minute of a very good solid state battery, laboratory scale battery. Now I want to say a little bit about dendrites, because that's a major issue. Still is a major issue now. And it turns out, although because they're stiff, they shouldn't allow dendrites to grow through, they do. And there are really two modes for growing dendrites. One seems to be just fracture induced. You fracturize the dendrite. And that occurs whenever you have a defect in the material, and you in the electrolyte, and then it starts growing from the tip of the electrolyte, and then it just gets enough pressure to just crack the material. And so they grow from that either along grain boundaries, which are a little softer, or through something else, or through just the material. So these are a serious issue. And of course, a softer, more malleable, or less brittle electrolyte is better, so it's not as big a problem as it is in the oxides. But the other problem is that somehow lithium seems to grow internal into the electrolyte without a connection to the lithium metal. And that either is happening in voids or grain boundaries or just in the material itself. It's not known experimentally exactly where it grows. We just know it grows inside the material. And that means you're running the reactions lithium plus electrons going to Li, neutral lithium somewhere. And that means you must have residual electrical conductivity. Now, you don't expect much electrical conductivity because all these materials are wide bandgap insulators, but you do have some, so that means there's some issue with defects and so forth like that. And at some place, these electrons must have enough chemical potential, there must be enough chemical potential at some spaces in there to drive this reaction. So we're actually looking at this right now with the people at ITU, Samet, Demir, and his research advisor. So I won't talk more about it in detail here. Okay, so let me just show you one example, what I think is probably the best battery that exists solid state right now in the laboratory, at least that's in the published literature. And this was an anode-free design where they took state-of-the-art nickel NMC cathode material, coated it with lithium zirconium oxide to isolate it from the solid state electrolyte, which was a chlorinated sulfide, this particular material. Then the only thing different is they had no lithium down here. The thing that was different is they had a silver carbon composite layer of a few microns thick. And if you just focus on that, what actually happened was when they went through this, when they now charged this material to plate out lithium, they formed this silver carbon composite floated to the top. It was all deposited below, and it made an alloy in here. And then when they went back, the silver went back into the carbon and so forth on down. It concentrated a little bit, but stayed. And with this, they were able to get a very practical discharge and charge for over 1,000 cycles. So this is the discharge of the battery, and it's stable to about 1,000 cycles. And then the charge of the battery. They lose a little bit of capacity, but not too much. Exactly how this worked is unclear. It was unclear to the authors, it's unclear to me, but it clearly has something to do with the alloying wanting to stabilize the lithium down below this material. Now I have to admit that although this looks great, there were a couple of experimental conditions that weren't practical for a real battery. One of them is they ran at 60 C, which is too high for a car battery. And the other thing is they applied a very huge pressure to keep the lithium as non-rough as possible. And that also is probably not practical. Let me just say that there are a lot of things going on in startup companies, which we don't know about because they're very secret. And so I don't know their status. All I know is the public literature. Okay, so let's see. So somewhere we're sitting about right here, right now, with kind of tailoring the conventional lithium-ion battery. We will get to here, somewhere in here. This is a fairly optimistic estimate. And if we ever get to, when we get to lithium metal batteries, we'll be somewhere in this region. If I have like 4 minutes, I'll try to tell you a little bit about a totally different kind of battery, the Lithium Air Battery, which I worked on for quite a while. It's not a practical battery yet, but it's a very exciting battery because it could have an enormous gravimetric energy density. So there's been a lot of work, extreme amount of work, and on it. So what it is, and I'll just take two. What it is just a lithium metal battery, a porous cathode, and you take oxygen from the air and react it electrochemically to form lithium peroxide. And that gives a potential of about 3 volts. And then if you apply a potential higher than that, you can drive this reaction back the other way. It's a very nice electrochemical reaction. However, the problem is, it works. The electrochemistry is very good. You have very low overpotentials, but it dies very quickly when you try to discharge it. And that's because this material that you're making is an insulator. So it passivates the electrode. So you can't live with that. And the other problem is when you drive it up, try to charge it, and this is a charging, and these are all done at constant current, and try to charge it, the potential just keeps going up, up, up. And that's due to the fact that you have a lot of parasitic chemistry going on. And there's absolutely, you're just reacting, something is reacting with the electrolyte and depositing actually lithium carbonate on the electrode. And so you just passivate it again. So it's not I won't, let's see. I won't try to go into too much of this. These are problems that haven't been solved yet. You can get the capacity higher by changing the reaction mechanism, but you also get more of this parasitic chemistry. So right now it's a battery that has, it can give reasonably high capacities, but it doesn't have a good cycle life, and no one has actually solved that problem. There are lots of efforts going around to kind of try to solve this issue using things called redox mediators, where you change the mechanism of the reaction a little bit and so forth, but none have been terribly successful. So let me just end with one comment. This is where we are now. Most of the people say, I don't know, some people say at any rate, that we may be here by 2025 by maybe getting silicon into the anode, optimizing the cathodes, but still staying with the liquid electrolyte. If we're going to get solid state batteries, that's probably on the 2030 time scale. I'm not sure we'll ever get lithium air into battery, but that's my own opinion. Many startup companies are actually claiming they will have solid state batteries in the 2025 frame, but you have to understand there's a lot of hype in the world of batteries. So I think I will end here and be happy to answer any questions you have. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this nice and exciting talk. Questions, please.
I'm trying to figure out how to do this.
There's one question. Alan, can you read this?
Pardon?
There's one question.
Yeah, I can't find the question site.
Can you see these questions, or shall I read it?
No, I can't see it.
So there's a question from Hasan Hussein Esanoğlu. He says,
okay, now I got it.
You can see now, yeah?
Yeah. Elon Musk is producing new batteries for electric cars. Okay, so most of what Elon Musk had to say, I listened to his proposal or his battery day. Most of what he had to say was in production of batteries and a different way to build the battery without tabs, tabless battery, which he claimed would give great changes in both power and energy density. and I have no way to judge on that. What he didn't offer were any changes that anybody hasn't talked about in terms of battery chemistry. I was underwhelmed by what he said about battery chemistry. He's going to go to more lithium, and they now have, everybody has a little bit of silicon in anodes right now, 5 to 10%. He's going to put more in, but so is everybody else. Going to take the cobalt out of the batteries. That's what everybody else is trying to do. So he didn't really say anything new that's not being already talked about heavily in battery chemistry. I mean, what he did say, and I tend to agree with it, if you want to be scalable in production, you need, the hard part is not building a battery in the lab, it's making the battery that goes into the car, it's producing the battery. And actually the hardest part was making the machines that make the battery. So that was his take on it. So I tend to think he'll get somewhere where he's talking about, but again, he's promised a lot before.
So other questions, please.
It was either very unclear or too clear. Okay, so I'll read it out and then answer it if I can. Mixing a solid electrolyte isn't an easy task, with efforts sometimes plagued by corrosion and fracturing of other parts of the battery. Ceramic materials are an option, but they're too brittle and often prone to be problematic. The Brown University team believes that graphene is the key ingredient to overcome this drawback. This makes sense? Yeah, graphene is a wonderful material. I don't know how you're going to make, what part of the, I'm not sure what part of the battery you think. I mean, people are using graphene layers in various parts. It is tough. Can you just tell me what you're thinking of in that respect? I mean, many people have tried to passivate, say, lithium metal with graphene. It is unclear to me what the question is, so I have to take a pass on it in that sense.
Well, other question, please. There's a question from Gökhan. Yeah.
Biocarbon action applications in lithium-ion batteries. Oh, God. Well, I can answer the supercapacitor one. I know nothing about biocarbon applications in lithium-ion batteries. The supercapacitor one is great for power, very bad for energy density. And it falls off very quickly. So there's been a lot of talk. So it's not going to give you long range. But it would, can give you very high power. So there's been a lot of talk, but no real application yet of mixing a supercapacitor for very fast charge, for example, and combining that with discharge. Because you mentioned that the biggest problem with most startups is that they can't, can everybody read this? So I don't need to read it or no?
Okay.
The biggest problem with most startups is that they can't produce it in a mass scale with cost efficiency. What kinds of research are being done to solve that problem? I think this part is a chemical engineering duty. Is there more work for chemical engineers in the battery industry? Absolutely. If any of you listen to Musk's battery day, his whole point was the problem is making the batteries, not the batteries themselves. And so, and it's actually building the process is the issue. So yeah, there's a lot of need for chemical engineers in that. That's one of the critical arguments to get to. There are a lot of gigafactories coming online now for batteries. I think most of them are using the same, more or less, generic processing that has been used for a long time. It's just being done in scale. And of course, I don't know what all they're doing. What Musk, his whole point was, what he's trying to do is to revolutionize the way you make batteries. And he did that in part by changing the structure of the, making so-called a tabless battery, where the connections are made in a different way, which affected the processing. Okay, aging is one of the issues with lithium-ion batteries. Are there any possible ways to improve this now? Oh my God. Yeah, you store them cold. There are two types of aging. One is cycling, and that's the Coulombic efficiency, and that's getting better. That's going to go to the million-mile battery within a year or two. Musk didn't announce it, but Jeff Don, his partner, has a million-mile battery in the lab. So that's cycling. The other one's calendar aging, and that is just thermal reactions instead of electrochemical reactions, which are parasitic reactions, and keep them cold. Store it in a refrigerator if you can. So actually, this is very interesting, because that's why you need such good thermal management of the battery. You need to keep these parasitic reactions down. And so actually Tesla, the first time around, when they first built it, did very good thermal management. Nissan in their Leaf had very poor thermal management, and they got into a lot of trouble because of that in the initial go-round. So it is an important part. Keep it cold or cool. In the literature, academic charging batteries between 2.7, 4.2. The commercial car and phones, you believe, charge at 4.2, or they limit at 3.8, 3.9. No, they go to about 4.2 now, or a little higher in the car. As I said, what you do, the higher you charge, the more unstable the cathodes become. So a lot of the effort is in trying to take them to higher potentials. And why they're unstable is still debatable, still being debated in the literature. Some people say there's a phase transition at the surface with the electrolyte. Some people say it's a reaction with the electrolyte. So there's a lot of work going on in coatings, but they do go higher. 4.2, 4.3, so forth. Is it possible to combine a good feature of supercaps with that of batteries in a single packet? I don't know the answer to this question to obtain a superior performance. Yes, it's been talked about a lot, and I don't know the analyses of that, combining a supercap and a battery. I know most of the car companies have certainly looked at that issue and haven't gone to the trouble of doing it. I mean, where you would particularly want the supercap is for regenerative braking in the car, where the currents can get very high in charging, or when you go to a very high intensity charging or very high power charging station. Tesla didn't do it. They bought Maxwell Industries, which was really a supercap company, but they bought it mostly for their dry electrodes, which they think will help their processing, their manufacturing. So no one's done it. So I don't know the answer to that. I think it's possible. What I will say, I don't know if any of you drive electric vehicles. I do have one. And one of the strong it's not only that they're better for the carbon budget, but also once you drive an electric vehicle, you never want to drive anything else again. The driving experience and owning experience is so much better. So in that sense, if the cost is competitive, I think electric vehicles will just take off like crazy. Any suggestions to increase cycle count of lithium-ion polymer batteries? Again, I think that is basically the question of the SEI. You still form the SEI. It's almost the same as a liquid battery. They are gelled polymers, so they're basically lithiums. Basically liquids, but held in place fairly well. So I think it's just a question of increasing making the SEI more stable is my guess. I haven't ever looked at lithium polymer battery. Actually, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer whether the SEI is exactly the same character as in lithium liquid batteries, but I'm assuming it is.
So if there are no more questions, maybe we can stop here. What do you think, Alan?
Yeah, that's fine. I thank you very much for allowing me to talk with you and give my opinions of the batteries. They're not universally shared by all, but.
Thank you once again for this nice talk and for joining us. As I wrote you before, we hope to see you in person here as soon as coronavirus settles away in the world.
Yeah, I would like to do that sometime. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Yes, thank you. It will be very nice to discuss these very exciting and hot topics face to face here with us.
Yeah, I thank you. I have been reading on the web. You people know about it, but that Turkey has plans to get very heavily into EV and batteries.
We have indeed keen interest in these topics.
Yeah. Very good. So I think your EV, your charging stations in 5 years will look like ours all over the place.
So hope to meet you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Please take care of you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.